Should we bring a laptop just to follow or should we just like...
Nope, just come hang out.
Yeah. It's cold here.
Should be broadcasting. Okay. 4 minutes.
About 4 minutes.
I don't know.
I guess because it's scheduled for 12.
Oh, that's right.
Okay.
Okay, cool.
That's kind of
Yeah, we should have done this before.
That's awesome. So I can just like chill and practice. And,
Okay, cool. So I can see the questions if they're coming in here.
oh, amazing.
So I don't know how many happy YouTubers are watching, but you can just let them know that like there's this question panel if they want to chime in.
Cool. Do you still have HackerU Slack?
I probably put that in login.
Oh, it's fine. I'll just ask Andrew or something to do it instead.
So which screen are you sharing?
I just have one screen.
Right. But like you end up with two.
Only if you like do like the presentation version thing of Keynote. I'm not going. Actually, I'll just like try it out and see how that works.
Just in your notes there.
Yeah. Ah, there you go. This is great.
I think that's what I'm gonna do when I do mine next. I'm gonna have two machines. I'm gonna live code, but like I'll have my like another laptop here with like all my examples, and I'll just be basically like transcribing them.
Yeah.
Wait, which channel have you on?
Or like if
Just
you need
do,
like
like,
your presenter notes for Keynote.
Party room or something.
Yeah, and say, just post this one.
I think I just posted something recently just for like Harsh's thing's about to start, and there's also a Q&A piece to it. Like you can ask questions if you open the.
Just click on this guy over here, and then get the Q&A panel will pop up.
That is so common. Like that should be more obvious.
You know, you just set the Q&A up here.
Exactly.
So wait, what should I say about the Q&A?
You can just describe it. Click on all these little squares here. And click on Q&A. This questions panel will open up.
Squares. How do you call that little square icon?
Looks like a Q&A icon maybe.
Yeah.
Hi.
It's not a phone icon, it's a little like huge icon. Right. This is such a great implementation of changing rooms for Slack.
Numbers? Yeah.
Yeah. And the short key, that's
Yeah.
awesome.
So nice. Where am I? Here.
I love that someone wrote today, we can walk in that question.
Okay.
That's so, yes.
You could probably just share your entire screen if you're going to do. I didn't realize you were doing that just mirroring.
Yep.
I thought you were going to do like the presentation mode.
Freezing.
That's what ended up
Whoa.
doing.
Well, I guess I should not share just yet because I have to say hello first.
Can you full screen that?
Well, no, like that's not being broadcasted yet. It'll just be my face first, and then when I share my screen, then you'll see the entire screen. Yeah.
So wait, it's gonna start automatically.
Yeah, in a minute.
1 minute.
That's so crazy. I feel like this is the
Are you
Apple
gonna start?
announcement. I'm about to announce like the next MacBook, guys.
Do you still have access to the sound effects that go behind?
Ooh, I don't know.
Sound effects, the applause.
I don't
You can put
know.
like a mustache on yourself.
Yes, where's the mustache?
Just draw
Yes, this is so
Wait, can
great.
you, wait, move
Oh,
your
this is
computer over a
drawing?
There's a panel there somewhere.
Alright.
For all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
little- I'm gonna move your computer over a little bit so that thing is in the way,
What's that?
the AC.
Oh, right. I'll sit on like the edge or something
Yeah.
and give away all our trade secrets.
What is that? Balls? No, it's just. Okay, you're live.
Am I live?
So,
Am I live? Oh my goodness.
yes,
I'm
you're
live.
live.
All right. We're just waiting for more people.
People that show up for pizza should die.
Yeah,
Pizza's coming late today. Hi.
Because you know I can see him. That's not good to you. Very good.
We have a bit of a crazy delay here.
I think that's what you see on
Yeah.
series.
Do your live prayers.
Cool. Is Safi? Safi's there? Hi, Safi.
Oh, you're not happy. Terrible. He says, Matt said that.
Fairly?
He's saying, "I'm not happy." Oh,
Yeah.
this is too much fun watching this live. I didn't know you were on here. I know.
Scooter's taken off?
Yeah, apparently.
Can't
Can't
handle
handle some video. Apparently. It's just trying to get us.
Hey, this is like design crew.
And we're Swaggy in it, dude.
All of the devs are like, we can't handle this. It's too much.
So is there you on your broadcasting?
Yep.
Yeah.
Just waiting for some more people.
It's a world.
Where do you see how many people are viewing it at the bottom?
Yeah, there's currently 9.
Is it all of us?
I don't think so.
It's just me, I think.
Hey,
Alex is moving around. He's moving around Slack.
Definitely not my house there, but they under Slack here now.
sure you're good to go?
Yeah, it's a good start now.
Cool.
Trickle in.
Awesome. Hello. Thank you for joining us for another TWG Tech Talk named Swaggy Layouts. Amazing. My name is Haris Mahmood. I'm a developer here at TWG. Follow me at Haris Mahmood 89 and check out my site if you'd like to look at what I have to say. Cool, so let's get started. We're going to be talking about 3 main things here today. Firstly, where we are today in terms of handling layouts on the internets. Then I'll be introducing you to the Flexbox concept, and then we'll be diving into some examples to see how it's extremely powerful and why it's super useful. So let's just talk about some layouts and where we are today. Originally, layouts started off being built using tables, not the most exciting way to do layouts, but that was sort of the default go-to. Then came along floats and inline block. That was pretty awesome, started saving some lives, trying to push the boundary of layouts quite a bit. But a lot of people still said that layouts are hard. And it's not necessarily that building layouts are hard, it's just that they're very tricky. Because the ways that we're currently implementing them using floats and using inline blocks aren't really meant for layouts, and they're all sort of hacks. So we're sort of misusing floats and inline block to essentially create these layouts for our websites, and that's not what they were built for, and that's not what they're meant to be used for. And that's why they end up adding a lot of additional complexity and a lot of weird stuff that you have to keep in mind when you're building your layouts. So like I said, floats and inline block were not designed to build site layouts. So there's a whole bunch of like really yucky issues that exist today, and like a lot of pain points that exist when you're building layouts today. First and foremost, vertical center. This has been around for ages. It's just like a really, really frustrating thing that is really difficult to accomplish. And
Sorry, your screen's not being shared here right now.
oh, really? Whoops.
You just have to go back and go to the
My
share
bad.
preferences.
Thank you for that.
Just in time for the meeting.
I know,
Yeah, we
right?
gotta get that in there, right? The audience is that.
I don't know. Where's the sidebar?
Never started that stuff. I'll just put the slides in where it should have started.
Navigator. Where'd it go?
I'll say this.
Sorry, I totally forgot to share my screen. Share.
Inception.
All right, sorry, real quick, just again. I'm a dev here at the working group. Amazing, moving right along. We've already done this, amazing, yes, yes. So layouts originally done using tables, pretty yucky. Floats and inline block came to save the day, it was pretty awesome. But they still don't provide the most amazing, they aren't the most amazing tools to do layouts. They're technically hacks, and people consider layouts to be pretty hard. And I like to think that they're tricky because the way we're building layouts are all hacky implementations, so they aren't the real way to do layouts, and therefore they end up becoming a little bit tricky. So a few examples of the challenges with doing layouts today. First and foremost is vertical centering, and back to the GIF that we jumped right into. You know, we're jumping out of space, but we still can't align stuff properly vertically using CSS. It's just ridiculous. With floats or inline blocks, there's just like really weird, hacky ways to do that, or you have to bring in JavaScript or something along the lines of that. Then there's a concept of sticky footers. There's a couple weird techniques to do this already, but they're not super ideal and they don't really work super well. This is the idea of you know, when you don't have enough content on your site, but you still want your footer to remain stuck at the bottom, only up until the point where you have, as soon as you have enough content, then the footer just sort of like falls into place and starts stacking per usual. And then there's something that's called the Holy Grail layout. This is sort of a representation of what this looks like. You had a fixed height header and footer that spans edge to edge. You also had a fixed width sidebars for your navigation and for ad space, for example. And then the center content where you have all of your actual context, all of that sort of just spans 100% of the amount of space that it has left over. And two things to note is, once again, the footer needs to stick to the bottom when there's not enough content present. And second, the center column should be first in your HTML markup because it holds higher precedence compared to the navigation and compared to your ad space. This is sort of the goal that everyone's been aspiring to. This is referred to as the Holy Grail, and we'll see if how Flexbox allows us to actually build all of these three layouts. So yeah, Flexbox comes to save the day. Flexbox is a relatively new layout module that was created to that allows us to build really efficient layouts. It's more complex than building layouts with floats and inline block, but it allows us to be more flexible. Sorry, I had to. But it's definitely less hacky, which is amazing. It was built purely to do layouts, which is amazing. So Eric Mayer, who's a renowned developer in the front-end development world, says that, you know, if you think you're excited about Flexbox, you're not excited enough because this is how amazing this actually is. So let's quickly talk about browser support before we jump into looking at some code examples. Yeah, you know, sort of. It's got pretty decent browser support. The biggest issue right now probably is IE. It's only supported on IE 10 and up. And the majority of projects that we do here at TWGs don't always support 10 and up. Sometimes you have to fall back to IE 9. So Flexbox isn't always isn't an option. But luckily, recently we did a project for the Globe and Mail, which was a purely mobile app that had a lot of web views embedded into the native code. And because Safari has great Flexbox support, we were able to use Flexbox and utilize its power for doing layouts for the app. So the lack of support goes beyond just the browsers. It's also other tools that you might be using. So in a particular case, recently we were using a plugin or a JavaScript library called ScrollMagic, and ScrollMagic actually does not support Flexbox. When we enabled Flexbox by default to try and do some layouts like that, it sort of just exploded in our face, and we had to default back to using inline blocks and floats. So a couple things. So these are important things to keep in mind when you're deciding whether or not you should use Flexbox for your next project. Cool, so let's just look at a really, really basic idea, not really a practical example, but just the overall concept that you need to understand before we dive into some code examples. So Flexbox sort of has two layers. The first thing to remember is the Flex container, and then you have the Flex children. So those are the two ideas that work really, really well together to allow you to use Flex layouts. So now let's have a look at some code examples. Sweet. Whoa. Let's see if we're back here. All right. So I'm going to scooch this over. Refresh this. Pardon me while I figure this out. There we go. Awesome. So in my code, I've just got a container div, and I've got 6 different items. They all have a class of item and item 1 to 6, just so we have a little bit more control. And in our CSS, we just have some base reset stuff. We've got some padding and some default colors. And we've given each of them a different background color so we can actually distinguish between the different sections. And I'm just going to move this over a little bit more. Come on. There we go. Awesome. So by default, all div elements stack. They have a default display property of block, which is why we see them all stacked like this. As soon as we apply the display flex property on our container class, that entire container is now a flex container. And all the items inside are now flex children or flex items. So as soon as we apply flex, you see a whole bunch of stuff happen by default. They start stacking next to each other. They're taking up a whole bunch of space. They're all the same height. So the defaults of Flexbox are already super, super awesome and super powerful. So we'll go through each of those and see what they bring to the table. So first and foremost, we have something called flex direction. This allows us to control the direction of the content flow. The default property is row, which we see here. Everything flows from left to right. We can also use row reverse, which reverses the entire flow and starts flow from right to left instead. We also have the option of throwing in columns, so it stacks as per usual, and column reverse the inverse of column, which is pretty sweet. I'm going to switch this back to row. Awesome. Next up, we have something called flex wrap. Flex wrap determines whether or not, by default, the property for flex wrap is no wrap, which means it's going to try and fit all of the items, all of the flex children into the same row. So for example, I'm going to give each of these items a width of 200 pixels. So, but they're still being forced to fit on the same line. So even if I were to resize this container a little bit more, they just get really, really squished. If I were to switch this to wrap instead, they now start stacking below, and as soon as there's not enough space, they move to the next row. So I'm just going to resize this again. Pretty nice, pretty nice. Alrighty. Next up, we have justify content. I'm just going to actually comment some of these guys out so we've got some more space. Sweet, so now we just got 3 of these items. Justify content allows us to align the content on the main axis, which is currently the horizontal axis where we've defined our flex direction. So flex start is the default property, flex end pushes everything all the way to the opposite end. We also have center, nice, and then we have a few additional nice ones called space around and space between. All right, awesome. I'm gonna switch this back to flex start. So let me just comment this out also. All right, so another property is called the align items property. By default, the property, the value for align items is stretch. Currently, we don't really see a difference, but that's because we haven't defined a height for our container. As soon as I give our container a height of 100%, we now actually notice the default property of align items being implemented. So it stretches the entire container to the height of the item itself. We also have the option of saying flex start. So it pushes it up to the top and just says, hey, just be as big as you need it to be. Flex end pushes them down instead. And center, magically have our things being vertically centered. Amazing. So I'm going to switch this back to stretch. Awesome. So align content. This is a slightly weird one. I'm going to switch this back to wrap and bring some of our items back in again. So we've got our items stacking again. They're wrapping to the next line if they don't fit. So the default property, so align content is used to determine the flow of the entire row of content or lines of content. So for example, right now, all of the items sort of stretch to take up the amount of space that they have available. What we can do instead is flex start, where it just takes up the amount of space that they need without any stretching. We also have flex end. We also have center, which sort of centers all the content into the center of the available space. And then we have space between, which equally adds space between the amount of rows that you have available and space around. Alrighty. So all of those properties that we just looked at are properties that you apply to the container itself. So it's always on the flex container. Now we can actually, there's a few properties that you can apply on the flex children also. So the first thing to look at is something called order. This allows us to control the order of items that are rendered in screen. So for example, I can apply order, everything by default has an order of 0. All flex children have an order of 0. If I apply a order of -1, for example, on item number 3, which is this purple item, when I save this, it should jump this to the beginning of the content, which is pretty sweet. So even though the HTML content shows item number 3 being placed 3rd in the markup, we can control its order with our CSS now, which is pretty sweet. I'm just going to comment this out again. All right, so then we have 3 more properties that sort of work together. These are the flex grow, flex shrink, and flex basis properties. There's a shorthand for this also, which is just flex. So you provide the flex grow, then the flex shrink, and then the basis property all in one line. So I'm just going to comment that one out and play with these individually. So what these allow us to do, or what these, I'm going to switch these back to just having 3 items again. Awesome. So what flex grow says is whether or not the items should continue to grow if there's available space. So if I switch this, by default it's 0, meaning don't grow if there's more available space. If I switch this to 1, when there's more available space provided, the items continue to grow, which is pretty nice. So flex shrink's default property is 1, meaning that they continuously shrink if they don't have enough space. So flex shrink property does exist and turn on by default. I can switch this to 0, which will force them not to shrink. So we will just get a horizontal scroll bar instead. There's some crazy trippy stuff going on back there. And last but not least, flex basis. This is sort of a weird one. One of the things that this is used for is to actually provide a width of the item. So instead of saying width 200%, we can assign that value here. And what this also does is sort of manages the amount of space that's in and around those items. So normally I like to reset this to 0. And this sort of says I'm no longer looking or paying attention to the heights and widths that you've assigned to me. So it just completely ignores it. And I like to normally set my flex grow and shrink to 1. And so this sort of gives a super fluid items that are constantly resized with the amount of space that they have available, which is super powerful. Right, I'm just going to add, oops, just comment the last 2 out instead. So going back to an example where we have 4 items, one really powerful thing that we can do is the flex grow and shrink values don't just range from 0 and 1. It's a ratio against all the other items that exist next to it, or all the other siblings that it has. So for example, I can give flex item 1 a flex grow property of 3, and what that does is it makes it 3 times bigger than all the other items that sit next to it, which is pretty cool. So it's kind of tricky to sort of try and figure out what flex grow value you want to give something if you want it to be 50% of the width available. So over here, we're saying 3 instead of the traditional 50% when you're assigning a width, but it takes a while to get your head wrapped around the concepts of Flexbox, but once you do, it's super powerful and allows you to be really flexible with your content. Alrighty, so now let's have a look at some examples of where Flexbox is super powerful. Alrighty, so firstly, we've got an example where we've got four different blocks, 4 divs. They just have a height and width of 100%, 100 pixels each. And I'm just going to apply the display flex property to them. So now they're sitting next to each other. And what I want to illustrate here is a very common ask when designing navigation. So it's very common to have your branding sit on one end and all of your navigation items sit on the other end, or sometimes all of your navigation on one side and the login button sit on the other end. Normally you have to do some really weird stuff, some floating here and floating there, and just gets really, really messy and really mucky. But what we can do instead now is, as soon as you've created a Flex container, I can pick a specific item. So item 2, for example, I want to move item 2, 3, and 4 all the way to the other end. So I can just say margin left auto, and it automatically pushes all the other contents to the other side. It automatically fills that gap with available space that exists. So, and it's super, super responsive. So no matter how big you make it, it just always stays there, which is super, super awesome. Sweet. So that's example 1. Example number 2 is goes back to vertical centering. So we've just got a container item, and we have one particular item inside with a class of item. We'll apply a display property of flex to our container. By default, our align items is set to stretch, so we're going to override that to center. And right now I have my width of this item set to 100%, so I'm just going to switch this to 50 so we can actually have it be smaller than 100% of the width. And then just to center it horizontally, I can just apply justify content center, which is super awesome. So this works amazingly well because your container can be of any size, the content can be of any size also. I can just add a whole bunch of additional content, and the item always remains centered, which is amazing. So just within a couple of lines of code, we always have a perfectly centered item inside our container. Alrighty, and last but not least, let's have a look at our a default sort of like the holy grail example that I was talking about earlier. So in our markup, we've got a site header. Then we've got a wrapper that contains our site content, our navigation, and our ad space. And lastly, we have a site footer. Our site content, as you notice here, is placed before the navigation and the ad space. So this meets the requirement of the holy grail ideal scenario. In our code, I've just added in some background colors and some padding just so we can be a little bit more obvious as to what all those items are. All right, so first and foremost, we want to grab the entire container. So grab this entire div that holds all of our content with a class of site and give it a display property. Oops, display property of flex. And this starts to do a whole bunch of weird stuff by default, so we can just not worry about that for a sec. And we want the flex direction to be column. So it continues to stack again, because we want the header on top, the footer at the bottom, and then we want everything else in the middle. So that's why we set the flex direction to column. We also set the heights to 100 VH. This makes sure that the amount of space that our site's going to take, or this container is going to take, is at least the entire height of our viewport. What we also want to do is we want to set the site body to a flex container also. Our site body contains the content, the navigation, and the ad space. So we want this to be a flex container also, because we don't want the orientation or the direction inside the site body to be column-wise. We want to switch it back to being a row. So display flex again. And by default, it has a flex direction of row, so we don't really need to apply that again. Amazing. And we also want to apply a flex property of 1. Flex property of 1 is sort of a shorthand for, oops, I'm just going to put that up here, sort of a shorthand for saying flex 1, 1 auto. So 1, 1 for grow and shrink means grow and shrink to as much as you need. Always make sure that you're fitting the amount of space available. When doing this, it sort of takes up the full amount of space vertically that it has left and pushes the footer all the way to the bottom, even though the content that exists in the content navigation and ad space containers isn't enough to actually push the footer all the way to the bottom, which is super nice. All right, then our site content, we want to give this a flex property of 1 also, because we want this to take up as much space as needed. So it's not taking up as much space. Amazing. And then we want to grab the navigation and the ad space. We want to give this a flex property also. We don't want these to resize. We want them to be a fixed width. So when we're giving the flex properties now, we don't want it to grow. We don't want them to shrink either. And we want to give them a specific width. So I'm going to give them a width of 200 pixels, for example. Now they have a fixed width of 200 pixels, and they're not going to grow and shrink at all. The last thing that we need to do is sort of reorder or refix the ordering issue that we have. We want to bring the navigation before the content container. The way we do that is .site navigation and give order -1. And so by doing this, it moves it. So some people don't like to use negative numbers for ordering, which is fine. You can sort of just assign it 0 or 1 and then increment the other ones after it instead. That's totally possible also. So for example, I could leave this one as order 0 and apply order 2 to these 2. Oh, I guess that doesn't really make any sense. We want this one to be first. So order. So this is -1, and then this goes back to 0, and this is also 0. So you can play around and control the flow of our content. And that's all I have. Wow, zoomed right through that. Damn, I got really excited. Sweet. So I guess this gives us some more opportunities for any questions that anyone may have. The one thing I also wanted to mention before we do so was just talk about the browser support again. Google Chrome is super nice. It handles the actual properties of Flexbox perfectly fine without needing any prefixes. But I highly recommend using an auto prefix or something when you're using Flexbox, because you don't want to be writing all the possible alternatives or all the prefixes for all the properties. There are a lot, and it gets really cumbersome to have to write 8 or 9 lines of code just to get display flex running. So I would totally recommend using a prefixer. Cool. So any questions? Yeah.
Are there any polygons worth using if you want to support all browsers?
Great question. So a lot of developers really want to use Flexbox, and as a fallback, they have polyfills to use inline block or floats when Flexbox isn't available. So that's totally an option. It just obviously requires a lot more work. You have to make sure that there's all these fallbacks. You have to test thoroughly to make sure the fallbacks are working properly. And one argument against that is because the CSS file gets a little bit bigger, you're making it slower for these older browsers to work with those CSS files. So sort of a trade-off. Yes, I mean, you get to use Flexbox and you're kind of slowing down those old browsers, but who really cares about IE8 at this point, or IE9? But yeah, like for example, at TWG, we don't really use Flexbox too often, except for when we get to build projects specifically with modern browsers or for mobile stuff instead, because of the browser support and because we support IE9. Any other questions?
You found any grid systems that are good that use Flexbox?
So there's a couple of grid systems out there that sort of don't really utilize the grow and shrink properties of Flexbox. They sort of just use the flex basis property and sort of just assign a specific width here instead. So it sort of just ends up being a regular grid system that you would find using floats or inline block that uses flex basis to assign widths. We actually used a grid system like that for the Global Mail project. At first, it seemed as though it's sort of similar to just to every other grid system, but we had the power of ordering and for changing the orientation of the content, the direction of the content, which ended up being super helpful for some of the scenarios that we had in our project.
Do you know if auto prefixer adds, I know there's like some flux when they were defining Flexbox originally, like the syntax changed quite a bit, and like different properties you could apply that don't exist anymore. Do you know if like auto prefixer will go to the trouble to add those in as well?
Yep. So originally there's been a variety of ways to use Flexbox. We originally started off with just display box, and Microsoft, I believe, was the first people to actually develop that code. And over the time, it's changed quite a bit, and now we're using display flex instead. And auto prefixer is super, super nice. When we used it in our project, we were able to actually like put in all the additional classes and whatnot. Sorry, the additional prefixes that we needed to support older browsers. We ended up not needing most of those because we were only supporting Safari. But when we worked on that TSM project, for example, and we were originally using Flexbox, we were able to support all variations of Flexbox all the way to the original syntax of Flexbox, which is pretty nice.
So auto prefix will have display flex, and then above that will have display box.
Exactly. Yep. So it ends up being pretty chunky. You end up having almost like at least 10 lines of code just to get display flex running, because it's making sure that it works across the board. Any other questions?
So I guess there's no situation where you use an existing grid system with like inline block alongside Flexbox.
I mean, like you don't have to use Flexbox to build your entire site layout. A lot of people I've seen just use Flexbox where they need to. So for example, if they're more comfortable using inline block or using floats or a specific grid system, if you're using Bootstrap, for example, but you come across this one place where you want to vertically center something, you're more than welcome to use Flexbox at that point. It is a very, very different way to approach your layouts. It's very confusing at first. It took us a while to get accustomed to it also. So a lot of you don't have to go deep dive into it and redo your entire site using Flexbox, and instead just use the parts that you need where you need them.
What's the relationship between Flexbox items and margining? Let's say, for instance, you want to add some space, like some margin between the purple navigation box and the blue content box.
Mm-hmm. So let's grab our content. Here. Margin. So it works just as you normally would. Yep, and it just magically figures out the amount of space that it has available left and just figures out the spacing it needs.
Cool. So that 40 pixels is not, it's counting it as part of the width of content.
Right.
So, so if you were to set them to be like, the other ones to be twice as big as this one, will that be taken into account for that calculation?
Well, keep in mind, we're not actually setting a width for content, right? We're just saying be as big as you can be. So it ignores the, reduces 200 pixels from the navigation and the ad space and the 40 margin that you just assigned. All that remaining space is assigned to content. So it's sort of weird, like you're not assigning a specific width to anything. So nothing sort of just like leaks out. It just recalculates how much space it has available and gives that to itself. Yeah. Alrighty, switch back here. Oh my goodness, stop screen sharing. Cool, well, thank you so much for joining us. If you have any more questions, feel free to shoot me an email. I'd be more than happy to hang out and chat some more about Flexbox. Yeah, sweet, thanks very much.